The wind that howls through the high passes of the Hindu Kush carries with it the dust of empires. For thousands of years, these jagged peaks in central Afghanistan have served as a silent witness to the folly of conquerors. They have seen the phalanxes of Alexander, the elephants of the Mauryans, the redcoats of the British, and the tanks of the Soviets. But centuries before modern warfare tore through these valleys, there was a moment when the mountains shuddered under the hooves of the most terrifying military force the world had ever known. It was the 13th century. The world was burning. From the steppes of the east, a storm had gathered, a human tide of iron and leather and discipline that swept across the known world with an efficiency that seemed supernatural. They were the Mongols. To the civilizations of Islam and Christendom, they were not merely an army, they were the scourge of God, a punishment sent from the heavens to chastise a sinful humanity. They were invincible. They were inevitable. They did not just defeat armies, they erased nations. They did not just sack cities, they depopulated them. By the year 1221, the Mongol war machine had dismantled the great powers of Asia with terrifying speed. The Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Islamic superpower stretching from modern-day Iran to Central Asia, had crumbled like a sandcastle before a tidal wave. The great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, jewels of culture and learning, were reduced to smoking ruins. The Shah had died in ignominy on a desolate island, fleeing the ghosts of his own arrogance. The people were leaderless, hopeless, and waiting to die. The myth of Mongol invincibility was absolute. No one could stand against the Tumans of the great Khan. To fight was to die. To surrender was often to die anyway. But myths are fragile things. They require belief to sustain them. And in a rocky valley north of Kabul, amidst the thin air and the unforgiving stone of the Parwan province, that belief was about to be shattered. This is the story of the moment the world learned that the Mongol demon could bleed. This is the story of a ragged coalition of desperate men, led by a prince with nothing left to lose, who looked into the face of the apocalypse and drew their swords. To understand the magnitude of what happened in the valley of Parwan, we must first understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe that preceded it. The collision between the Mongol Empire and the Khwarezmian Empire was not an accident of history, it was a tragedy born of hubris. Genghis Khan, the unifier of the steppes, had initially sought trade, not war, with his western neighbor. He sent a caravan laden with goods and goodwill to the city of Otrar, a border town of the Khwarezmian realm. He sent a message to the Sultan, Muhammad II, addressing him as the ruler of the West while calling himself the ruler of the East. It was a diplomatic overture, but the governor of Otrar saw only spies and spoils. In a decision that would doom millions, the governor seized the goods and executed the merchants. When Genghis sent ambassadors to demand justice, the Sultan, blinded by his own perceived greatness, shaved the beards of the envoys and beheaded the interpreter. In the Code of the Steppes, this was not just an insult, it was a declaration of total war. The Khan went to the top of a sacred mountain, bared his head to the sky, and asked the eternal blue heaven for vengeance. And vengeance came. The invasion that followed was unlike anything recorded in the annals of warfare. The Mongols moved with a coordination that baffled their enemies. They utilized a network of spies to sow discord before a single arrow was loosed. They used terror as a strategic weapon, calculating that if one city was massacred to the last child, the next 10 would open their gates without a fight. The Khwarezmian Sultan, commanding a massive army on paper, made the fatal error of dispersing his forces into garrisons to protect his cities. He tried to build walls against the flood. The Mongols simply isolated each garrison, surrounded it, and crushed it. The Sultan fled, a broken man, chased by the legendary Mongol generals Jabei and Subutai, who treated the hunt for an emperor like a sport. The empire collapsed into anarchy. But from the ashes of this disintegration rose a figure who would become a legend in the Islamic world. A man whose tenacity stands in stark contrast to his father's cowardice. His name was Jalal al-Din Mangburni. Jalal al-Din was the eldest son of the Sultan, but he had been passed over for the succession due to palace intrigues and the lineage of his mother. He was a man of the sword, dark complexioned, serious, and possessed of a martial fury that the times demanded. While his father ran, Jalal al-Din fought. He understood that the open plains were death traps against the Mongol cavalry. He knew that to fight the horse lords, he had to drag them into the terrain where their speed was negated. He had to go to the mountains.
Dust and blood mix.
After his father's death,
eyes.
Jalal al-Din took the mantle of sultan, though he was a sultan of nothing but dust and refugees. He gathered what remained of the shattered Khwarezmian forces. These were not the pristine regiments of the imperial guard. These were survivors. They were hardened Turkic cavalry, fierce Afghan tribesmen, gory warriors, and mercenaries who had seen their homes burned and their families slaughtered. They were united not by loyalty to a state, but the state was gone, but by a burning desire for revenge and the sheer necessity of survival. He led them south, through the treacherous passes of the Hindu Kush, towards the city of Ghazni. The journey itself was a trial of endurance. Food was scarce, the cold was biting, but as he moved, word spread. The prince is alive, the prince is fighting. Men trickled in from the wilderness to join his banner. By the time he established his base of operations near the Parwan Valley, he had assembled a formidable force. Historical estimates vary wildly, as they always do with ancient sources, ranging from 30,000 to nearly 100,000 men. The core of this army consisted of his own Turkic troops and a large contingent of Afghan warriors, led by a powerful chieftain named Saif al-Din Idrak. It was a fragile coalition. The Turks and the Afghans had a history of mutual distrust, held together only by the charismatic leadership of Jalal al-Din and the looming shadow of the Mongol advance.
Both
Genghis
armies
Khan,
retreat
currently
slightly.
occupied with the destruction of cities
75
further
Mongols
north, became aware of this
losses,
gathering storm in the south. He did not initially lead the army himself. To the great Khan, this was a mopping-up operation, a task for a subordinate. He dispatched Shigi Kutuk, a high-ranking commander and his own adopted brother, to deal with the nuisance. Shigi Kutuk was a man of the inner circle, raised in the tent of Genghis Khan's mother. He was a brilliant administrator and a supreme judge of the empire, but his experience as a field general was limited compared to the dogs of war like Subutai. He was given a force of approximately 30,000 to 45,000 Mongol cavalry.
82,
in the eyes of the Mongols, this was more than enough. They had defeated armies 3 times that size on the open plains. They were drunk on victory, suffering from the dangerous disease of overconfide. They believed their own myth. The Mongol army moved south, crossing the mountains with the hardiness that defined their people. They expected the Khwarezmians to scatter or to break at the first charge. They did not expect Parwan. The valley of Parwan is a narrow, stony place, flanked by steep cliffs and cut through by a river. It is terrain that claustrophobically restricts movement. For a Mongol army, which relies on fluidity, wide flanking maneuvers, and the ability to retreat an envelope, it was a nightmare. Jalal al-Din knew this. He had chosen his ground with the precision of a master tactician. He positioned his forces to block the valley, anchoring his flanks on the high ground so that he could not be encircled. When Shigi Kutuk arrived, he found the Khwarezmian army waiting. The silence of the valley was broken by the thunder of drums and the shrill cry of the war horn. The stage was set for a collision that would echo through history. The battle began in the morning. The Mongols, adhering to their standard doctrine, unleashed a storm of arrows. The recurved bow of the Mongols was a marvel of engineering, capable of piercing armor at distances that shocked their adversaries. Usually this barrage would soften up the enemy, creating gaps in the line that the heavy lancers could exploit. But Jalal al-Din had prepared for this. He ordered his men to dismount. This was the critical decision. By dismounting his heavy cavalry, he presented a smaller target profile and allowed his men to use their heavier shields more effectively. Furthermore, by fighting on foot, the Khwarezmians negated the Mongol advantage in horsemanship. The rocky, uneven ground of the valley floor was treacherous for horses, leading to broken legs and stumbled charges. The Khwarezmians, fighting shoulder to shoulder, turned the battle into a grinder. The Mongols charged. Wave aft. Year wave of heavy cavalry slammed into the shield wall of the Khwarezmians. The clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, and the dust choking the air turned the valley into a vision of hell. But the line held. For the first time in decades, the Mongols found an enemy that did not break. Jalal al-Din rode up and down the line, exposing himself to danger, shouting encouragement, his sword wet with blood. He was everywhere at once, a beacon of resistance. The Afghan archers positioned on the slopes began to rain fire down upon the Mongols. In the confined space, the Mongols could not maneuver to clear the heights. They were trapped in a kill zone.
114.
The battle
Afghan
raged until
contingent
sunset, a
feels
grueling,
insulted.
bloody stalemate.
Tension
When
rises.
darkness fell, both armies pulled back,
115.
exhausted.
Night
The Mongols
falls.
were stunned.
Camp
They had
is
lost
uneasy.
thousands of men. The invincibility was chipping away.
Afghan
That
tribes
night,
pack
in the Mongol
camps
camp,
and leave
Shigi
silently.
Kutuk devised a ruse.
117.
It was a classic trick of the steppes,
Archers and
one that
cavalry
had fooled many
vanish
armies
from
before.
coalition ranks.
He ordered his men to fashion dummies out of straw and
Jalal
felt.
al-Din
They placed
wakes
these
to
dummies
find
on their
his
spare
army
horses.
halved.
The Mongols always
119.
traveled with multiple
Victory
remounts,
feels
so they had
hollow.
thousands of extra
He
animals.
surveys the emptiness.
By mounting these straw men, Shigi Kutuk
120.
hoped to create the illusion that a massive
Mongols
reinforcement
regroup
army had
and
arrived during the
report to
night.
Genghis Khan.
When the sun rose over the peaks the next
121.
morning, the
Khan
Khwarezmian
listens
soldiers looked
calmly,
across the valley and
critiques
gasped.
tactics.
The Mongol army appeared to have doubled in
122.
size.
Beneath
Fear,
calm,
cold and sharp,
volcanic
gripped the coalition.
fury
The
simmers.
whispers began immediately.
123.
They are endless, the men
Realizes
said.
Jalal
We are fighting
al-Din
demons
is
who
a
spawn from the
legitimate
earth.
threat.
The commanders of the Afghan contingent
124.
debated retreat.
Orders
Why die
main
here against an
army to
infinite enemy when they
mobilize.
could slip away into
He
the
will
mountains?
lead personally.
This was the moment the battle could have been lost.
125. Mongol
Panic is a
march
contagion,
south
and
begins
tea spreads
unstoppable.
faster than fire.
126.
Jalal al-Din saw his army
Genghis
wavering.
Khan
He
rides
convened a hasty war
relentlessly
council,
across
not to
plains.
debate, but to command.
127.
He realized the trick,
Horses
or perhaps
are
he simply
pushed to the
refused to
limit.
acknowledge the odds.
Riders sleep
He
in
pleaded
saddle.
with his commanders,
128.
appealing to their honor, their
Siege
faith,
of
and their
Bamiyan
hatred of the invader.
begins. Walls
He convinced them to
defended
stand for one
fiercely.
more hour. The second day of battle
129.
began.
Mutakon's
The Mongols,
grandson
emboldened
is
by their
killed
ruse
by
and
an
expecting
arrow.
the enemy to crumble from psychological
130.
pressure,
Khan's grief
attacked with renewed
explodes
ferocity.
into
But Jalal
apocalyptic
al-Din
fury.
had a counterstroke.
131.
He realized that the Mongol center was
City is
aggressive but
razed.
brittle.
No
He waited.
living thing
He absorbed the
spared.
pressure. The
132.
Khwarezmian line bent, pushed back by the
Corpses
sheer
litter
weight of the
streets.
Mongol assault.
Flames
The dust
consume
rose in
homes.
blinding clouds.
133.
Then, at the critical moment,
City
when the Mongols were
renamed
fully
City
committed
of
to the attack,
Screams.
Jalal al-Din
134.
unleashed his reserve.
Jalal al-Din retreats
ordered a general
toward
charge.
India.
But not just a hold-the-line
135.
defense, an offensive
Mongol
charge.
dust cloud
The
visible on
Khwarezmian heavy
horizon.
cavalry, remounted now that the lines had
136.
closed, smashed
Map
into the
overlay.
Mongol formation.
Chase across plains
Simultaneously,
and
the
mountains.
Afghan warriors on the flanks descended from the
137.
heights like
Jalal
an avalanche.
al-Din
The trap
approaches
snapped
the
shut.
Indus River.
The Mongols, compressed into the narrow
138.
valley, could not retreat.
Boats
Their famed
expected are
flight,
gone.
a tactic they had
River
used to destroy
swells
empires,
violently.
was impossible in the cramped terrain.
139. Mongols
Panic, usually the
close
weapon
in.
of the Mongols,
Escape
turned against
seems
them.
impossible.
The Mongol army broke.
140.
It was
Sultan
not an
forms
orderly
men
withdrawal.
into a
It was a
crescent
rout.
at riverbank.
The hunters became the prey.
141.
The Khwarezmians pursued them
30,000
mercilessly,
men
cutting them
brace
down
against
as they fled north.
50,000 Mongols.
Shigi Kutuk, the
142.
proud brother of the Khan, barely escaped with his life,
desperate
fleeing with a
fury.
handful of survivors.
143
The valley floor was
charges
carpeted with the
target
bodies of the
Mongol
invincible
center,
horde.
seeking
The victory was
Khan's
total.
banner.
It was absolute.
144.
For the first time, a major Mongol
Mongols
army had been
initially taken aback by
annihilated
ferocity.
in open battle.
145.
The news spread like wildfire
Khan
across
keeps
the Islamic
elite
world.
reserve hidden.
In the cities that were still under siege,
146.
defenders cheered
Flank
from the walls.
maneuvers through
In the
rocky
mountains,
terrain.
rebels sharpened their swords.
147.
The psychological stranglehold of the
Khwarezmian
Mongols
flank
was broken.
collapses.
They were men.
Units
They could be killed.
shattered.
But history is often written by the
148.
flaws of the
Jalal
victors as
al-Din
much as the strengths
sees
of the
defeat
conquered.
approaching.
What happened next is a tragedy that renders the
149.
victory at Parwan
Family
almost moot,
in camp.
a lesson in how
Fate
human greed
uncertain.
can undo the greatest of triumphs.
150 some accounts.
In the aftermath of the battle,
Sultan
the Khwarezmian
orders
camp was
family
filled with
drowned
spoils.
to avoid capture.
The Mongols traveled with immense wealth,
151.
looted gold
Other
from China,
accounts,
silks
family
from Persia,
captured by
and
Mongols.
thousands of magnificent horses.
152.
Among the plunder was a
Jalal
single
al-Din
white Arabian
prepares for
horse,
final
a creature
act.
of exquisite beauty.
153.
A dispute arose over this
Strips
horse.
armor,
It began
keeps
as an argument
sword
between a
and
commander
banner.
of the Afghan tribes and the
154.
father-in-law of Sultan
Spurs
Jalal
horse
al-Din.
toward steep
Both men
riverbank
claimed the
cliff.
horse as their rightful prize.
155.
Voices were raised.
Hooves
Pride was
strike
challenged.
earth.
In the
Men
heat of the moment,
watch in
amidst the
horror.
adrenaline of victory,
156.
the Sultan's father-in-law struck the Afghan
Mongols
chief with
raise
his whip.
bows ready
It was
to
a petty
shoot.
act, a moment of foolish arrogance.
157. Horse
Jalal
and rider
al-Din,
leap into
exhausted
violent
and
river.
perhaps failing to grasp the fragility of his
158.
coalition,
Water
did not
crashes.
punish his father-in-law.
Currents pull fiercely.
He tried to mediate, but the insult had been struck.
159.
The Afghan code of honor, Pashtunwali, is rigid and unforgiving. An insult to a chieftain is an insult to the tribe.
Shaking fist
that night,
at
under
Mongols.
the cover of darkness, the Afghan contingent, nearly half of the army, including the vital archers who had held the high ground, packed their camps and left. They deserted the Sultan, over a horse, over a whip, over a
should
pride.
have such a son.
Jalal al-Din woke the next morning to find his army gutted.
Mongols
he had won the Battle of Parwan, but he had lost the war in the celebratory tent.
Jalal al-Din
he was left with only his own Turkic forces, a brave but insufficient number to face what was coming next. And something terrible was coming. When the ragged survivors of Shigi Kutuk's army reached the camp of Genghis Khan, the great Khan did not fly into a rage. He did not execute the defeated general, as lesser men might have. He sat quietly. He listened to the report. He critiqued the tactics, pointing out where Shigi Kutuk had failed to use the terrain. He treated it as a learning experience. But beneath the calm demeanor was a cold, volcanic fury. The Khan realized that this was no longer a mopping-up operation. Jalal al-Din was a legitimate threat, a symbol that could rally the entire West against him. The Khan ordered his main army to mobilize. He would not send another general. He would go himself. The march of Genghis Khan towards Parwan was the march of death itself. He moved with a speed that defied logic. He wanted to catch Jalal al-Din before he could regroup. Along the way, the Mongols besieged the city of Bamiyan. During the siege, a favorite grandson of Genghis Khan, a young boy named Mutu Khan, was killed by an arrow from the walls. The grief of the Khan was apocalyptic. When Bamiyan fell, he ordered that no living thing be spared, not a man, not a woman, not a child, not even the dogs or the cats or the livestock. The city was razed to the bedrock. It was renamed the City of Screams and left as a barren monument to Mongol wrath. This was the force bearing down on Jalal al-Din. The Sultan, realizing his coalition had evaporated and he could not face the main Mongol host, fled towards India. He hoped to cross the Indus River and find sanctuary with the Sultanate of Delhi. The chase was on. It was a race against time, across the blistering plains and through the mountain passes. Genghis Khan pushed his horses to the breaking. He slept in the saddle. He ate while riding. He was possessed by the need to extinguish the last spark of Khwarezmian resistance. They caught him at the banks of the Indus. Jalal al-Din had arrived at the river, but he was trapped. The boats he had expected were gone or destroyed. The river was wide, turbulent and swollen with meltwater. Behind him, the dust cloud of the Mongol army filled the horizon. There was nowhere left to run. The Battle of the Indus was not a battle. It was a last stand. Jalal al-Din formed his men into a crescent with the river at their backs. He had perhaps 30,000 men left against the full might of the Mongol horde, numbering over 50,000 veterans led by the Khan himself. The fighting was desperate. Jalal al-Din fought with the fury of a doomed man. He led charges into the center of the Mongol line, seeking out the Khan's standard, trying to cut the head off the snake. The Mongols, usually disciplined, were taken aback by the ferocity of the Khwarezmians. At one point, the Mongol center actually buckled, but Genghis Khan kept his reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, ready. He sent a tumen around the flank, navigating through difficult rocky terrain that the Khwarezmians thought was impassable. The flank collapsed. The Khwarezmian army was compressed against the riverbank. One by one, the units were shattered. Jalal al-Din saw that all was lost. His family, his mother, his wives, his children were in the camp. The accounts of what happened to them are harrowing. Some say he ordered them drowned to save them from slavery. Others say they were captured. But the Sultan himself had one final act of defiance. Stripping off his armor, but keeping his sword and his banner, he spurred his horse toward the riverbank. The bank was a steep cliff, dropping 30 feet down to the churning waters of the Indus. The Mongols hot, elted, watching. Genghis Khan rode to the front of the line. He watched as Jalal al-Din whipped his horse and leaped. It was a jump of suicidal bravery. Horse and rider plunged into the air, crashing into the violent current. The Mongols rushed to the
103
edge, knocking their arrows, ready to turn the Sultan into a pincushion. But Genghis Khan raised his hand.
104
Hold,
Valley
he
floor
commanded.
littered
He watched
with
as the Sultan
bodies.
surfaced,
105
gasping, struggling against the current.
Victory is total,
He watched as
but
Jalal al-Din
exhausting.
climbed onto the opposite bank,
106
water streaming from his clothes,
collapse,
shaking his
breathing
fist at the
heavily.
Mongol army on the cliffs above.
107
Genghis Khan,
fires of
the destroyer of
celebration
nations, the man who had
mingle
erased
with
Bamiyan for the
blood-soaked
death of a
ground.
grandson, stared across the river with a look of
108
profound admiration.
Commanders count
He turned to his
spoils
sons and
of
said,
war.
"Such a father should have such a son."
109
In the brutal
Among the
meritocracy
loot,
of the
a
steppes,
single white
bravery was the
Arabian
only currency
horse
that mattered,
gleams.
even in an enemy.
110
He forbade his men from
Dispute
pursuing.
erupts
He
between
let the Sultan
Afghan
go.
chief and
Jalal
Sultan's
al-Din would live on
father-in-law.
for another decade, a
111
wandering king without a kingdom,
Voices
fighting battles in
escalate.
India,
Pride
Iran,
and
the
honor
Caucasus.
clash.
A tragic figure forever
112
running from the shadow of the
Father-in-law
Mongols.
strikes
He would
Afghan
eventually
chief
die in
with a whip.
obscurity in the mountains of Kurdistan,
113
killed by
Jalal
bandits for his
al-Din
clothes,
tries to
unrecognized and
mediate,
alone.
failing to
But the
act
legacy of Parwan
decisively.
remains.
114
It is a complex legacy.
Afghan
On one hand, it was a
contingent
tactical
feels
masterpiece,
insulted.
a demonstration
Tension
that the Mongol
rises.
war machine had gears that could be jammed.
115
It
Night
proved that
falls.
terrain, courage, and
Camp
leadership
is
could overcome the
uneasy.
recurve bow and the pony.
116
It gave hope to a world that had
Afghan
lost
tribes
it.
pack
On the other
camps
hand, it is a
and leave
cautionary tale of the
silently.
highest order.
117
It illustrates the fatal flaw of the
Archers
resistance
and
against the
cavalry
Mongols,
vanish
disunity,
from coalition
the
ranks.
Khwarezmian Empire, and indeed the entire
118
Islamic world at the
Jalal
time,
al-Din
was
waits
fractured
to
by
find his army
tribalism, sectarianism,
halved.
and petty
119
jealousies.
Victory
The
feels
coalition at
hollow.
Parwan defeated
He
the Mongols,
surveys the
but they could not
emptiness.
defeat their own internal demons.
120
The argument
Mongols
over the White Horse is a
regroup
metaphor
and
for the
report
entire
to
era.
Genghis Khan.
While civilization burned, the
121
commanders argued
Khan
over the
listens
spoils.
calmly,
If the coalition had
critiques
held,
tactics.
if Jalal al-Din had been able to keep the Afghans and the Turks
calm,
united, could they have
volcanic
stopped
fury
Genghis Khan?
Simmers.
Perhaps.
123
The terrain of Afghanistan has defeated greater
Jalal
armies than the
al-Din
Mongols.
is a legitimate
unified
threat.
resistance in the Hindu Kush could have bled the
124
Mongol Empire dry,
orders main
forcing
army
them to
to
turn back to the
mobilize.
steppes.
He
History
will
could have
lead
been rewritten.
personally.
Baghdad might not have fallen 40 years later.
Mongol march
The golden age of
south
Islam might have
begins
continued
unstoppable.
uninterrupted. But the coalition did not hold.
126
The unity
Genghis
fractured,
Khan
and the Mongol
rides
tide swept on,
relentlessly across
washing away the
plains.
old world and paving the way for a new,
127
brutal order.
Horses are pushed
Today, the
to
valley
the
of
limit.
Parwan is quiet.
Riders
The bones
sleep
of the
in
Mongols
saddle.
and the Khwarezmians have long since
128
turned to dust,
Siege
feeding the
of
sparse
Bamiyan
grass that grows
begins.
between the rocks.
Walls
The river
defended
still flows,
fiercely.
indifferent to the blood that once stained
129
it.
Mutakon's
But if you listen
grandson
closely to the
is
wind in the
killed
passes,
by an arrow.
you can almost hear the echo of the drums, the
130
clash of
Khan's
steel,
grief
and the roar of the small
explodes
army
into
that, for one
apocalyptic
brief
fury.
shining moment, made the gods of war bleed.
131 City
This
is
event
razed.
serves as a reminder
No
that no
living
power is
thing
truly
spared.
invincible. Every empire, no matter how
132
terrifying,
corpses
has a
litter
breaking point.
streets.
Every wave
Flames
eventually breaks
consume
upon the shore.
homes.
The Battle of Parwan
133
stands as a monument to
City
human resilience,
renamed
a
City
testament
of
to the fact that
Screams.
even in the face of annihilation,
134
there are those who will
Jalal
stand and
al-Din
fight.
retreats
It is a story
toward
of glory
India.
and tragedy, of a victory won by
135
blood and lost by
Mongol
pride,
dust cloud
etched forever into the
visible
granite
on
of the Hindu
horizon.
Kush.
136
As we look back through the centuries,
map overlay,
through the smoke of burning
chase
cities,
across plains
the
and
dust
mountains.
of thundering hooves, we see Jalal al-Din not
Jalal
just as a king,
al-Din
but as a
approaches
symbol of the
Indus
enduring
River.
human spirit. He
138
lost everything. His
Boats
father, his empire, his
expected
family,
are
and
gone.
eventually his life.
River swells
But on that rocky
violently.
field in Parwan, he did not kneel.
139
And in the end,
Mongols
that is
close
what
in.
history remembers.
Escape
Not the
seems
silence
impossible.
of submission,
140
but the sound of the sword drawn
Sultan
against the
forms
darkness.
men